Tēnā tātou katoa, no mai haere mai, and welcome to this evening's online presentation to share the findings of the Socio-economic Impact Assessment for the Head of Lake Whakatipu Natural Hazards Adaptation Program. Ko Jamie McKenzie toku ingoa. I am Jamie McKenzie and I'm in the Natural Hazards Adaptation team at Otago Regional Council, and it is my pleasure to be facilitating this evening's session. So firstly, I will open our space in this session with a karakia. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki waho, tuia ki roto, tuia ki te here tangata, ka rongo te pou, ka rongo te ao, haumie, huie, tai kie. Welcome everyone to this evening's session. Thank you all for those who are attending, and thanks for everyone who might be watching this at a later date online. I will just let you know at this point that we have had a bit of a problem with our recording, so I'm redoing this introduction bit and I'll catch you up to speed from where our recording began. So first things first, we'll just have a bit of a welcome and some housekeeping notes, and then we will get into the program introduction, which will be led by Dr. Jean-Luc Payan, the Otago Regional Council Manager for Natural Hazards. So he'll talk a little bit about the program and how the study fits in with the wider work that's going on, and then signal some next steps of what you can look forward to for later in the year. Then we will have our presentation by the Beca team led by Joe Healy to present the findings of the Socio-economic Impact Assessment. Following that, we will have a Q&A with Beca and ORC staff, and then we will wrap up this session with a karakia. Just some short housekeeping notes. One person, one microphone. If you could please leave your microphone muted while the presentations are going. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat function to share your thoughts as well. Otherwise, you can use the raise hand function and ask your questions once the presentations are complete. We do have a moderator on hand to help facilitate discussion and assist if you need any help. And this presentation will be recorded and is available to watch on the ORC website now. And just a note here that the presentation will be recorded, but the Q&A session has not been recorded. Awesome. So at this point, I would hand over to Jean-Luc Payan, but his first two slides cut out, so I'll just be covering those really briefly, and then we'll start the recording. So why do we need to adapt? So the area at the head of Lake Whakatipu faces really complex natural hazard challenges, from flooding, liquefaction, earthquake challenges, landslides, and even multi-hazard events. So we know that there's some really complex natural hazard challenges there. And we also know that the landscape and the climate are changing. We can see these changes occurring maybe in the past or some projections into the future. And so those two things in combination make for a really dynamic environment, but also a really complex one, and which means really that there's no simple solution to addressing natural hazards and some risks at the head of the lake. So this means that we really need to come together, speaking about ORC, QLDC, iwi, and the community and civil defence to manage natural hazard risks and adapt to these changes now and in the future. So it's really about coming together to take a bigger picture look at some of these challenges. And that's what the Head of Lake Whakatipu Natural Hazards Adaptation Program is all about. You see, the key word really on this slide is all about resilience. So this program is really wanting to build resilience of the area, and resilience means lots of different things in lots of different ways, and there are many different ways that we can build the resilience. So that's what this program is all about, to try and look at it from different perspectives and to address these challenges. So in that respect, we're taking a holistic approach to managing these natural hazard challenges and uncertainties. So thinking about the bigger picture of what's going on to try and address these things. And that means that there's lots of building blocks we need to support decision-making and support making well-informed decisions. So those are things like the science and technical studies, community engagement, a risk assessment, this study, the Socio-economic Impact Assessment, and much more. So that that really covers the approach that we're taking. We know there's lots of different pieces of the puzzle that need to come together to think about what we're going to do in the future. And just highlighting again that we're doing it in collaboration with Queenstown Lakes District Council, Mana Whenua, and the community. Kia ora. I'll hand you over to Jean-Luc now.
The way we are developing the program is using the Ministry for the Environment guidance around adaptation, and the diagram on the screen here is a good illustration of that. It's if you focus on the outside of the circle, there are 5 questions there. If we start from the top, what's happening, what matters most, what can we do about it, how we can implement the strategy, and how is it working. Those are really key questions that are guiding the development of the program, and we are now in the phases really looking at what can we do about the change, what can we do about the physical environment. Part of that approach, we're also using a method called dynamic adaptive pathway, and this is a really powerful tool that helps plan for the future when we know things are changing, but we don't know exactly how fast and when things will start to happen. So the plan is designed in a way that it gives some certainty on what's coming in terms of decision, but also it gives the flexibility of adapting the plan in the future. Next slide, please. So what are we trying to achieve with the adaptation strategy? So first thing, it's really a way to plan long-term decision, to try to keep ahead of the changes instead of reacting to the changes. It's also aiming to have a common understanding of the environment, of the changes, and what's important, what the community value, how those values are going to be impacted by the changes. And tonight is really about that. And finally, it is about decision making and helping future decisions to be made. So we are at nearing a key step in the process. So if we go to the next slide, Jamie, please. What you have on the screen here is those 5 questions that have been put in a table, and every cell is showing either work that's been completed in green, or work currently in progress, or work in orange, sorry, and work that is planned in the future. So the key message here is a lot of the preparation work around understanding the physical environment, understanding what the future could bring, has been done, and we are really now focusing on developing the options and the solution. But one key information that we wanted to present tonight is about impact of hazards. Next, please. So tonight, Beca, Joe will present the finding of the socio-economic impact assessment. And one reason we did that social impact assessment was driven by the community, or some member of the community asking for this, recognizing that this needs to be understood to be able to put the next stages of the plan together. So what's coming next in between now and the end of the year? I said before, it's kind of key step in the process. We are nearing the end of the preparation of the strategy. We are aiming to have the first iteration of the strategy draft going for feedback to the community, to you, in September, October, and aiming to finalize the first iteration by November, December this year. So we are now at really the end of that cycle before the implementation starts. So hopefully you get good information tonight. Feel free to ask all your questions, and I thank you for your attention. Now I'll let Jo present her work. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thanks very much, Jean-Luc. So it's my pleasure to introduce everyone to Joe and Jerry, who are going to be presenting for us this evening. So Joe is a senior associate at Beca in Auckland and a senior leader in Beca's social outcomes advisory practice. She leads the climate change social impact work for the team. Joe has spent 20 years as a health professional and the last 10 working in the natural hazard and social impact and social research space. And Joe led the project and the engagement with the community. So some of you might recognise Joe from her time in Glenorchy. And also here today we have Jerry Khoo. So Jerry is a transport economist with 18 years experience leading the economic evaluation of a wide range of infrastructure projects in New Zealand, Australia and across the Asia Pacific. Some notable experience included development of the economic values that are adopted in the New Zealand's monetised benefits and cost manual, review of economic benefits and costs of increased heavy vehicle loading standards, and also was part of the team involved in the independent review of the investment decision-making framework. So we've got some really strong expertise in the room, and I will just hand it over to Joe and Jerry and get their slides ready for you now.
Thanks, Jamie. Awesome. All good to go?
Yes, all good for me.
Kia ora koutou, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to present tonight the findings of our assessment, the social economic impact assessments we completed for the phase 1 of the Head of Lake Whakatipu Natural Hazards and Adaptation Strategy. Firstly, before I proceed any further, I'd like to take this time to thank the community, especially all those who participated, sharing both their time and their thoughts and making this a data-rich assessment, and I couldn't have done it without you, so thank you very much. If we move on to the next slide. This work was largely undertaken from about October last year to December. I was down in the community in November and we finalised it this year. And I'll take you through our team next, which is the next slide. So this is the team. There were some other members as well who worked on this project. Myself was the project lead. We had some technical reviewers. Jerry, who is presenting tonight as well, did the economic support. I'll just let Jerry introduce himself.
Thank you, Joe. Jerry Khoo here. So I'm a technical director at Beca based in Auckland, and that's something that I assisted Joe in terms of this project here. And I think in terms of looking at the baselines of the economic activities, employments, the GDP, and all that, it relates to this region in general.
Thanks, Jerry. And as you can see, we had other members of the team in terms of GIS support, communication support, and our DAP advisor and climate change specialist, Dr. Laura Robichaud. I'll move on to the next slide. So the objective set by Otago Regional Council for us was to better understand the social and economic baseline and impacts of potential natural hazard scenarios on the well-being of people and communities at the head of Lake Whakatipu. So that's what we were tasked with undertaking. So if we move to the next slide, I'll talk to you about what we did first. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and if any of you have read the report, I hope it didn't put you to sleep, but it is a long and lengthy report, so this is a whistle-stop tour. Our methodology was based on a series of best practice guidelines under the overarching framework of the dynamic adaptive pathways planning that Jean-Luc talked about before, and we fit within that to look at the potential social and economic impacts of natural hazards. And I'll briefly take you through this process if we move to the next slide. So first of all, what we did was to understand the Regional Council's program, so we could understand the work that was done to date on the strategy, how that fit, what it was that the risks that we were dealing with, and then the broader community and hazard context from a social economic perspective. This is to understand the who and what parameters of our assessment. Moving to the next step, the first step this step was to identify the preliminary social-economic area of influence. And what that means, put simply, is that this is the communities that would experience potential impacts from a natural hazard event, either due to living in the area or economic or social dependencies connections to the area. The primary area of interest was the Head of Lake Whakatipu, but we also looked further afield around Queenstown as we identified tourist operators, other suppliers, and social connections that depended on or provided services to the head of the lake community. So once we had the area that we were looking at and we understood the context and the types of things that we should be looking at, we moved on to trying to establish and understand the social and economic baseline, which we will outline a bit later in the presentation. So what we did for that was we relied on a range of data sources, desktop reports, economic data, census data, council data, and the like. And there was a series of interviews and engagements, as I said, as I was down with my colleague in November. All in all, we undertook 55 interviews, and these were face-to-face interviews, online interviews, focus groups. We met with the school students, we met with community representatives, we met in Queenstown with tourist operators, we met with various providers in the community, and we had drop-in sessions. We also ran a survey, and then I will pass it on to Jerry to talk about the data that he relied upon for the assessment.
Thanks, Joe. I think on top of the some of these surveys and data collection that Joe mentioned, we also, for some of the other economic data, we also look at the infometrics sort of economic data that provides a lot of insights, including employment, the spending, and the GDP across the region. We also look at some of the tourism spending data provided by Queenstown NZ, so that we can look into understanding the regional tourism sort of estimates for the region. And we also look into other sort of information such as the New Zealand census data, in terms of looking at overall employment statistics, and the Department of Conservation in terms of like the number of visitors, the trampers, and also other data sets such as like the firm data and kind of things as well, so that it paints a better picture around the numbers on the economic activities in the region. So those are some of the key data sets that we relied on.
Thanks, Jerry. And then step 4 was to identify and evaluate possible social and economic impacts of indicative natural hazard scenarios. These were high level based on the available information at the time on the relevant hazards that have been completed by Otago Regional Council. Scenario 1 was a major alpine fault, which included liquefaction and shaking damage. Scenario 2 was a major flood event greater than 100-year annual recurrence interval, which is the regularity it is anticipated to occur. And scenario 3 was repeated moderate floods. We compared that to status quo conditions in the existing community and the current hazard management response. So in terms of what we focused on from a social perspective, we looked at a range of social indicators. This is basically components that make up how a community functions. We explored the way people lived, including recreation, work, education, their community services, including health, various services within the community, how they came together, the character, how decisions are made, the living environment, the amenity of the living environment, health and well-being, property rights, and the sort of the values, the fears, and the aspirations of the community. We looked at considered the impact, the cause of the impact, who would be affected, the extent of the effect, the duration that that effect would likely occur for, and the likelihood to understand what the potential social impacts were of these scenarios. I'll let Jerry talk on the next slide to the economic indicators considered.
Joe, extending on what Joe mentioned around looking at that from an economic lens, we look into some of these economic indicators, and they are primarily around the looking at the direct losses and indirect losses, as a result of some of these impacts. So the direct losses are primarily those that are resulting from your building infrastructure damages, and then your indirect losses will be the other sort of things that follow on as a result of those physical damages, such as your in terms of your short-term economic losses, your long-term employments, and other things as well as a result of those sort of damage to your sort of direct losses, as a result of that.
Thanks, Ray. Sorry, I just lost the light there, but it's come back, thank goodness. If we move to the next slide. So then we looked at the community baseline key findings. The purpose of the community baseline is to understand the community in order to understand what's important, how it functions, including social and economic independencies. This data is important to then understand what and how the community and economy is likely to be impacted. It also, in the future, can test the impacts of different strategies to address risks. So moving to the next slide. Whilst I want to gloss over this part, as I feel like I'm telling a community about themselves, and you are the experts on yourselves, I will go over some of the factors that we unearthed. This is only a snippet of what is written in the report. This community was very generous in sharing with us and rich with information. It is a small but growing population with new developments and has a large visitor population, largely being day visitors. It's a tight-knit community with a diverse population. As one person said, radically different people, diverse people from many backgrounds and walks of life, however everyone respects each other. We then looked at the next slide. We did various activities where we asked people what they valued in the community and what their community values were. From this slide represents the various values and the things people valued that we heard. The larger the print on the screen, the more that was repeated in terms of a key value for the community. And you can see nature, community, environment, community spirit, lifestyle, scenery, locals, resilience were key values that were identified by the community. Next slide we looked at was the key finding was about community cohesion. A key is how this community comes together through organised community groups. In my work, particularly in response to natural hazards and climate change, I speak a lot about social cohesion. It is the shared values and ways a community comes together. For a small community like yourselves, you are reliant on each other for many key functions in the community, many of which are through volunteer activities. The large number of groups you have relative to your size demonstrates how you function. This does change over time, and as new people move in, connections to Queenstown are stronger, more part-time residents, particularly from overseas. But at the core, these were some of the quotes and sentiments that reflected this element, and I couldn't put it better myself. This is also in the report if you want to catch that later. So in terms of community organisation and governance, this is a chart that we prepared to help us understand how emergency governance worked for this community, how they organise themselves. A lot of community direction was taken from the local community response group, which is still developing, as I understand, to help direct people, and had been just trialled for a anticipated flooding event before we arrived. So we spoke to the people about how that worked. And then moving on to community organisation and governance. And as I said, people is a key asset to this community and key to how it functions. I think one person said it better than I ever could. Cultural volunteering is an invisible but pervading characteristic of the community, and I wish I was that eloquent. I'll now pass it over to Jerry, who will talk a bit about some of the baseline activities of the economy. I apologise to Jerry because I did the slides and he's stuck with graphs, but he will make it exciting, I promise.
Thank you, Joe. So in terms of the economy for the area, so we look into the last couple of years, and so in terms of the number of employments, in terms of the full-time equivalents, it's generally between just short of 400 to 600. So basically, you look at just across the country, perhaps in many regions as well. There's especially those that are reliant on tourism. You see a dip in the numbers, primarily due to some of the closures, particularly due to the borders. So if you look at the numbers that on the yellow one in terms of the estimate tourism employment, so that's dropped since 2020. in terms of looking at the numbers there. But in looking at the numbers for the non-tourism sort of sectors, we've got numbers around there that remains relatively, broadly, similar. It's also experienced drop, which I'll come to later in this slide as well, because it's, a lot of these economies are quite interconnected as well, because they are highly reliant on each other in some instances. So a high proportion of those non-tourism sort of employments are primarily related to the hospitality sector, such as your accommodation and your food services, followed by the art and the recreational services in terms of the key categories there. Moving on to the next slide. So in terms of the contribution in terms of the GDP, in that follows a relatively similar trend as before. So I guess some of the notable things is basically, in terms of the GDP is approximately around $40 million annually, and that is pretty much approximately about $75,000 sort of per capita. If we look into the per capita perspective. A lot of the research participants, when in these projects, noted that the spring and summer months are perhaps the busiest times of the year in terms of the business activities. So I guess in terms of the concentration of these values, I think will probably lie between the spring and summer months. And then in terms of the tourism, so I guess again, like what Joe mentioned, I know we're telling things that you already know, and in some ways, so it's quite a popular tourism sort of destination, offers a range of activities for visitors to enjoy, such as like a jet boating, your tramping, your fishing, hunting, horse tracking, skydiving, etc. It's quite a lot of things there, and I think the visit number shows like between 300 to 800 people visiting there in the township daily, and approximately 100 to 200 plus people visiting in the wider area within that as well. And then in terms of the economy as well, there's also quite a popular filming location. So I think while they're not sort of like a long-term sort of like firm businesses located in the area in terms of the permanent ones, but they do come in from time to time, and some of the production sort of companies, when they come in, they do base in Glenorchy temporarily, so therefore relying on your local accommodation as well. So that's basically some of the key sort of snippets in terms of the from the economic perspective.
Thanks, Jerry. So one of the things that we looked at, obviously, as we were trying to understand the social and economic impacts of different hazard scenarios, was the experience of natural hazards and community preparedness. There was evidence of experience of previous events. People had some ideas, particularly around flooding, of how the community worked, what to anticipate. Two key emergency documents, both internal and external. At the time, one was currently in draft, and then we looked at, so that was at the community level, but we also looked at people in terms of their preparedness, and you'll see on the next slide, similar to the one before, that responses of how people prepared for weather events, and it was clear that by nature of living where you live in the elements, people were attuned to the environment and largely prepared for it to change. I don't think I've come across a school engagement where people were talking about generators, testing the levels of the lake, lights, that even the kids were talking about how they would prepare. They had, full ideas of what they would do. The operators had, schemes of rebooking, road closures do occur, so people had ideas, power, things like that. So people were prepared. In terms of just going into that further on the next slide, it was clear that if the road closed or there were issues, there was an expectation initially to have to rely on yourselves and your own assets and have a clear understanding on what is available resources within the community. This community is traditionally used to being isolated and still understands that this is a possibility from time to time, and as such has many tools and strategies to manage that initial time of isolation. And this is just some of the things that people gave us examples of, which for a small community is quite a diverse range. So moving on to the status quo assessment, that is what happens now and how the responding is now. And if I move to the next slide, this is talking to sensitivity, and what we mean by sensitivity is how likely someone is to feel, or someone or an asset or a business is to feel the impact of an event. So how sensitive are they to experiencing, how at risk are they to experiencing an event? So that's what we mean by sensitivity. And I'll let Jerry first talk to the economic sensitivities of the current community.
Certainly. So in terms of the status quo sensitivity for the economic sort of lens, as also outlined, in terms of the diversity. So, in terms of the from an income perspective, there's a large range of incomes, in the region, from those who have a much more subsistence in transient sort of lifestyle, taking casual employments to full-time employments, into some of the sort of high wealth individuals as well, in the region. So we've got a sort of large range of that from the economic sort of income perspective. I did mention a little bit about the reliance and interconnected in terms of the industries there. So obviously in terms of the is heavy reliance on the driven by the tourism, and that also have the largest sort of impact around the hospitality and film production and all that, because they are again highly dependent on one another. And even the changing in the visit numbers has also a considerable influence on the community sort of economic stability, because a lot of people, when they visit there, they have to find things for instance to do in the area as well. So again, that also means that you also have the reliance on the natural sort of resources in terms of providing the mountains, the lakes and rivers and the landscapes for the operation of the businesses in the region. And in terms of the built infrastructure, obviously, it's also highly reliant on some of the key infrastructure to get to region as well. So the Queenstown Glenorchy Road, for instance, is one of the key sort of critical sort of infrastructure in terms of getting the tourists into the Glenorchy as well. So this is just a general sort of just an overview. Obviously, there are a lot of more in-depth things in the reports as well that you mentioned.
In terms of social, based on the discussions with research participants, there were several vulnerable sectors identified in the community. High needs community were those with mental health challenges or without adequate resources or plans in place to prepare for or recover from a natural hazard event. This part of the community is most likely to need to rely on others for support. There were tourists, visitors to the area. This part of the community would require shelter, resources and transport out of the area. People with multiple low-income jobs and unemployed, this part of the community may need support to afford to remain living in the community and manage that initial response. Temporary workers, those who have short-term jobs in the head of the lake and are newer temporary members of the community with less social connections. The older population that may need support physically to evacuate their homes safely and are more likely to require health and medical care. And then young children and families that do not have a wider family in the area, as part of the community may require support because they don't have the social infrastructure available around them. Several participants also expressed concerns about the breadth and depth of emergency services personnel in the area. Specifically, research participants were concerned about the people with specialist skills would be spread thin in an emergency and would risk, those volunteers would be at risk of burning out. It was also highlighted that key emergency infrastructure such as the fire station and St. John's Ambulance are located in areas highly susceptible to events, which places the service and communities' access to the service at risk. So that was some of the sensitivities. And if we move to the next slide, this is the adaptive capacity. So that is adaptive capacity. What I mean by that is how able people are to respond to risks, how able they are to adapt or to make themselves more resilient. So from a community's perspective, key things were decision-making and leadership. particularly in the face of an event, financial security or support, food and water security. People had stores of food, access to water, housing security, social connectedness, and knowledge, awareness, and skills to face natural hazards. These are just some of the adaptive capacity identified. A lot of what I spoke to in the community baseline and the hazard preparedness also speaks to the adaptive capacity of the community. And I'll let Jerry talk to the economic adaptive capacity of the status quo.
Thanks, Joe. So in terms of the economic sort of adaptive capacity, broadly, the business community is highly resilient, and they basically can, in the short term sort of impacts, there's a way of actually managing that in some ways. Definitely not ideal, but there's as I said, it's highly resilient. You can find ways of to be able to manage that for some quite a few areas. And the business community actively seek a lot of sustainable sort of operations to mitigate some of this risk, ensuring that the resilience in the face of these challenges as well. And as I mentioned before, due to the dependence on the natural environment, the visitors and critical infrastructure, so this does leave them, leave it, the area quite highly vulnerable to these natural hazards. Is to show that a lot of the dependency across the infrastructure and the importance of the environment, and the natural environment, in terms of supporting the economic livelihoods, in that region, in that regard.
Awesome. So we move to the next slide. So as I said, we did scenario assessments. I'll just caveat that with they were high level, the level of detail we had at the time. We got given a, this might be the area exposed, these might be the types of damage, the number of damage, but it was at this very high level. So this is just potential social and economic impacts that may occur. These are potential risks or impacts that could possibly occur, and it would be very much dependent on the specificity of the event when it occurred. But this just gives some examples. So if we move to the next slide. So I haven't gone into huge detail here. There is a lot more detail in the report. A lot of the impacts are the same for each scenario, just the scale, extent, and kind of level of damage differs, but the types of things that occur are similar. If a road is out, if it's 2 days, it'll have this sort of effect. If it's 4 days, and the scale and the extent of the effect continues. The key things that were impacts on the way people live, because their houses might be damaged, temporary or permanent displacement, where they might live in the future and what that means to the way they live. Also in terms of how they get around in the community, in terms of just social connection, but also the way they work with the road, one road in, one road out, and more people reliant on or working in Queenstown. Also the customer base that Jerry talked about coming in, education, disruption of getting to high school, tertiary education, the issues around community cohesion, very much so coming together initially when there are, that immediate event and those decisions. But then in terms of longer term rebuild and recovery, where are people going to live? Are they going to stay in the community? What is their tolerance? What has their experience been? Is it too much for them? And that's where, with a community like the Head of Lake Whakatipu, there are key members who are key volunteers or have key roles in the community. And if they were one of the members that had to leave or move to another part or temporarily relocate, that could impact the community cohesion of the area, because there is much dependency on that volunteering and community roles in many things. The character, that might be the damage of natural assets with siltation, or the halls, or some of the historic character of the area, damage to community services such as the fire and ambulance building, other buildings, also access to services such as health in Queenstown and other services in Queenstown. And then, so these were kind of the themes. And as I said, with a minor event, it might not be, it might be short term. However, if that short term happens quite often, then people's tolerance may change. They might question the viability of living in the area. Repeated disruptions may be worse than one long one. It just depends. It might also impact the viability of different industries. And then, as I said, as the event severity, what that will mean is the duration of these impacts will be longer and the extent will go wider within the community. Obviously, in like an earthquake type event, there will be shaking, different types of damage to what a flooding event would happen, but the social impacts will be similar. They'll just be more or longer or more likely. So that is a kind of a whistle-stop tour of the types of social impacts that were identified for different scenarios, and I'll let Jerry talk to the economic impacts.
Joe, in a similar vein to what Joe mentioned, it's probably quite similar from the economic impacts as well, across the various sort of the natural hazard scenarios that we look at, and again, it ultimately relates to how significant the event is and how long the impact will be for. So ultimately, I think as we mentioned before, some of the indicators we look at are the direct sort of infrastructure or the building sort of damages. So we look into the damage, into the number of houses damaged under those different scenarios potentially, and then what is the cost of having to reinstate some of these infrastructure, such as your road, your pavements, and all the stormwater drainage and all that. And also like the cost of response and relief as well. And obviously, that relates back to again how severe the impact of some of these hazard scenarios are. And then we also look into some of the as a result of that, some of these the short term and the long term sort of economic losses. And because if you have a much more longer closures and then you have significant impacts the ability for your tourists and visitors to be able to visit, and then they will have a flow-on effect in terms of in terms of your accommodation, your hospitality sectors that supports that as well, and then also indirectly some of other things that also supports those other industries as well, because visitors tend to visit, but they also look for other activities to do when they're on the ground as well. So and then when it comes to employment, that also really depends on, I guess, in some ways, the scale of the hazards, and also in terms of the different sort of employment sort of contracts that people may have as well across a very sort of diverse sort of group of population in the area. So which means that it could cause some uncertainty and financial hardships, in many cases. And then in a much more severe sort of sort of like natural hazard scenarios, then there's sort of significant sort of impact to the businesses, because it means like and as a result they will have a lot of like flow effect of actually creating a reduction in hours or job losses for people in the region as well. So I guess they are all, as I said, sort of quite interconnected in that sense.
Yeah, and what I will say is that these identification of potential impacts helps with and what Jean-Luc was talking about in terms of that adaptation planning, because you can look at the risks and the types of impacts and look at how you can increase the adaptive capacity in the way and reduce the sensitivity in terms of to these events and the potential risks. So this is useful information to go, well, what could we do to make it so that they could recover faster, or that there are these issues. So this is why this information is important to have a look at, to understand what needs to be planned for, what needs to be made more resilient, where are the issues that lie ahead. So thank you very much for listening to us. We're both keen to stop talking and hand it over to Jamie to do the question section. Just again, thank you for being part of this assessment.
Well, thank you very much, Joe and Jerry, for your presentation. I'll just remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, or if you can raise your hand, you can also ask them in person. But I've got a good question to start us off. So this is to Joe and Jerry. So in your experience, you know, both of you have a wealth of knowledge and experience and have worked with many other communities or places around New Zealand. I'd be really interested to know how does Glenorchy kind of compare in terms of that kind of socio and economic space? How might they compare in terms of their resilience to other places or other, you know, work that you've done?
Yeah, as I probably alluded to in some of the findings, the kind of level of engagement, active engagement in the community and self-organisation and volunteerism is much higher than I have struck anywhere else relative to the size of the community, and then the awareness of the environment and the response and the kind of self-preservation activities are very, very high. But then there are things like it being quite an isolated community, you know, that one road in, one road out, you know, having to organise its own health service, primarily in the service, and being reliant on another service for pretty much most, you know, another town for most services. It's, you know, there are other communities that are small and rural, but I suppose it's that one road in, one road out kind of scenario that makes it unique in that respect. And then that kind of day visitor, tourist, there are other communities like that, but, you know, this is key for Glenorchy. So very resilient, but also got some challenges that they are aware of and facing. That would be my take. Jerry, I don't know whether you've got anything to add.
I don't know, very well, summarized there, Joe. I think totally agree with that. I guess, you know, it compares to, like, you know, very well, I guess, in terms of many other countries that I worked in as well. I think one thing that is quite well done here is in terms of the overall process. I quite like, you know, in terms of looking at that adaptive planning and in terms of understanding the different stages and trying to answer the different questions. Because I think sometimes when they look at some countries, while they might have a lot more funding, for instance, but they might just jump straight to solutions without actually understanding, you know, what they're trying to solve but what they're trying to achieve. So I guess from that perspective, I think this is quite good to actually understand what are the questions we try to, what are key questions we try to solve along the way. I think that's quite an important sort of process as well, in my view.
Well, thank you for that. And I will, I should have said as well, we have some ORC staff members in the room as well, so you're welcome to ask Joe and Jerry some questions, but we also have Jean-Luc, the manager of natural hazards, as well as Anne Conroy, the team leader for natural hazards adaptation, Simon Robinson, the team leader for natural hazards analysis, and Tim Van Warden, our senior natural hazards analyst, available around for questions as well. But I see that Councillor Alan Somerville has his hand up, so feel free to share your question.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you very much. Yeah, look, Alan Somerville, councillor based in Dunedin here. Look, you noted the large number of day visitors to the Glenorchy, and I just wondered what extra challenges that brings to the local community should there be some natural hazard event. Your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and I think I spoke to that in the assessment and the identification of those potential vulnerable communities. If you're coming for a day, you're not taking a huge food supply, you're not arranging a place to stay, you're not taking a lot of clothes or supplies with you. So if an event occurs, you're often very unprepared. You don't have a place to stay, you don't have additional food supplies. So if there was an event and people were cut off, that is a community or an aspect where the Glenorchy community would have to absorb those day visitors and find places for them to stay and find places for them to eat. So they would have to share their resources. So that's probably the significance of day visitors in that respect. And also their intention wasn't to stay, so they'll be wanting to go quickly as well. So there'll be pressure on that. So that's probably one perspective. Jerry, do you have a economic perspective to that?
From an economic perspective, I think, you know, a lot of day visitors actually indicate that the Glenorchy as a region is mainly the entry, you know, to, you know, in terms of what people want to see in New Zealand. I think if you look at a lot of the international sort of surveys and kind of things, the region and the broader sort of Queenstown region as a whole is is one of the primary reasons why people want to come to sort of New Zealand to visit in the first place. So I guess like any impact on that would also have a broader impact as well, in terms of the economies to the broader region, and also like to the country as such. So there's a much bigger sort of flow impact from that perspective as well.
And I would just say also that there is that dependence on that road going in and out and wanting to kind of go in and out quickly. So that's probably the other aspect of that.
Okay, hey, thanks very much.
Awesome, thank you. I see John Glover has his hand up. So John, feel free to share your question.
Yeah, sure, and good evening, everyone. Just watching with my community association and personal hats on, and please don't be dismayed by the lack of community attendance on this call this evening. You are competing with the quiz night in the pub.
Heard this.
So, which is where probably everyone else will be tonight. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of re-watching of the session when it comes out. Joe, thanks for the social side of stuff. It's great to describe some of the stuff that you found in our community, and we look forward to welcoming you when you decide to move here. And I think you've captured that really well. I think the scenarios have been really valuable, because I think what we will do as a community is try and workshop a bit of that around, well, this is what's likely to happen. What do we think we would want to do when it happens? Because if we can have that conversation beforehand, we'll be much better placed, because we'll have a plan, we'll have thought about it. So we won't have the Burwood experience where my mum used to live, where the whole neighbourhood just was scattered to the four winds because no one had thought about it. So I think really important to run through those scenarios, and yeah, just what would good outcomes be for the community in each of those, and what would it take to achieve those. So I think that's something we'll try and lead from the community association later on in the year. So thanks for that. Just a question for Jerry on the GDP. So the 13.5 million. How is that? Is that the money that is generated out of the Head of the Lake by the businesses and that are based there, and the visitors that come and spend there? Could you talk to me a little bit more about that figure?
Yeah, absolutely, certainly. So a lot of the figures that we've got is actually an estimates as well, in terms of the contribution of that from a national lens. So if we try to split, let's say, New Zealand into a couple of regions, then that's where where Glenorchy would sort of and the region would contribute as in terms of the GDP from that perspective. So obviously in my view, in terms of if there's any impact, the impact to the GDP is would effectively be larger than that, because as I mentioned, I think there will be a flow on impact towards the regional and the national impact of this as well, because like a lot of visitors as you know come to New Zealand. As I said, this is one of the top of the things to do in the country. So without of which then perhaps it's something like maybe they'll just bypass New Zealand for somewhere else. For instance, there'll be a proportion of that. So I guess to answer your correct question, I think that is just solely focusing on the region in terms of that, in terms of the employment and kind of things that actually happens within that region itself. So in terms of the number of, let's say, for instance, people doing the filming and all kind of things, it's also an estimate of people sort of having sort of some of those things on the ground there. So it might not be companies that are sort of permanently located in the region, but they do employ people in the region from time to time. So it's just it's try to sort of spread it across to understand like potentially in terms of the region, how much of the GDP does it actually sort of contribute in terms of from a national lens. Probably
okay, thanks, Lex. So the reason I ask is the figure seems incredibly low. If that's the money that's generated, I would say it's probably an order of magnitude low. I would imagine that Dark River Jet Safaris and Blanket Bay between them will turn over around 13+ million just between the two companies. So so that's why my question was, what is the income that is generated out of, because obviously you've got all the services, all the businesses. I know what my own business turned over last year, so that's why I question that figure as being very, very low. So
and so I won't dispute your sort of observation there, John, and in that instance, because as you know, like, you know, a lot of that is basically based on what the information that is publicly available to us as well. So that's only as much as we can do in terms of try to attribute, you know, that, you know, to, you know, looking a couple of balance and checks, looking at, you know, the people employed, from number of people employed in the region and all that. If we look at from that lens, you know, then how much would that be? But again, totally acknowledge that there will be quite a few of those that, you know, that will be really hard to quantify, you know, accurately in that sense. But I think one of the key takeaways from myself, you know, personally as well, is like there's a lot of the impact, you know, even if we can quantify that, you know, accurately for the region, I think the significance of the region in the NZ perspective cannot be underplayed in my view.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just think it's important to know, because I know people look at the numbers, and if somebody is saying, you know, well, that's all it's worth up there, then that impacts the decisions made about the cost of doing things and intervention. So I think it's really important that we get that. And just one last question for both of you, and then I'll shut up. Is the resilience, the one road in, the one road out, and the access to Glenorchy by water, is are either or both of you able to speak to what you see as the importance of being able to maintain that going forward?
I think any kind of activity that gives an alternative or a kind of a plan B would be useful. The use would be depending on how functional, how frequent, how it kind of caters for the community would be the questions I would have. I think in an emergency perspective, it would be good because people would be able to get home, or people would be able to leave and reconnect, or you could get tourists back. But in terms of if the road was out for a while, it would just be how that operated, whether it was dependent on private boats, which you'd have to be connected to someone who had a private boat, although that sounded, when I interviewed, there were quite a few. It would just be how able that was to kind of cater for people's work commutes, education commutes, business requirements in terms of delivery of services, those sorts of things. So it would be good to have a plan B or a resilient plan A. It just would depend on how it kind of caters for the functional requirements of the community, would be my answer. I don't know whether you've got anything to add there, Jerry.
No, I totally agree. I think a lot of that is just you know, not all one eggs in the basket sort of perspective when it comes to, you know, planning for resilience. And I think from, you know, as you said, like there's one road in, one road out. So I think, you know, that, you know, we cannot, you know, it's unlikely you can do any, you know, many more roads in, and then given the constraints physically. So I guess in terms of any sort of major events, and making sure that you've got other alternatives, you know, that you'll be able to bring it in, both from a transport infrastructure, as well as in terms of your telecommunications perspective as well, and being able to actually have a lot of those sort of things in place, and in terms of your plan B and or plan C. So having those, I think, will be highly sort of critical and useful in my view.
But there might be answers from the team that want to answer that question as well. I'm not sure.
Joe, can I step in there? And sorry, Nikki, I know you've got your hand up. I'm just going to jump in front of you. Bill Nicol from QRDC. I'm response manager in the civil defence kind of capacity for Queenstown Lakes District Council. I'm just pleased to report, John, that we did have our first lake evacuation workshop on Tuesday morning of this week. So that was represented by Mick from Dart River. There's plenty of discussion around how we use the lake under that kind of AFH scenario. So just to give some assurances to John and to any of the community that's listening, that I guess the early stages of looking at how the lake can be best used for a mass evacuation. So we're in the early stages of starting that planning process, but it's been a great exercise to start with the stock take of the vessels that are on the lake and understanding exactly what the nature of the wharves and jetties are and the rest of it. So it's a multi-stakeholder, multi-agency approach, and you'll probably hear a bit more about that in the near future.
Thanks, Bill. And just following on from John's point, I see there's a question that asks, can you supply us with the sources for the GDP figures that the GDP figures were derived from? Jerry, do you have those on hand? Otherwise, we can get those.
Probably best.
Yeah.
We can send them. I think
Okay,
would be
so then,
best.
Yeah, that's sure. We can follow those up later. And it's great to hear, John, how the community are already thinking about how the this report will be able to support kind of their own resilience building at that community scale, as well as for the ORC Hazards Program too. So next I'll go to Nikki Gladding.
Hi, thanks, Jamie. I think I know everyone on the call, but just in case, I'm the local councillor and I'm based in Glenorchy. Just agree with everything John said there, and just reiterate that point around the importance of getting the numbers right and understanding what we are worth to the wider region. I think that's critical to get those figures right. And just following on from sort of what Bill said, well, it's sort of, I suppose it's in the same vein. I think, the short-term and longer-term resilience of the community, I think, depends a lot on how the supporting agencies are prepared and the maturity of that insurance piece as well. So everything else that goes on is going to impact us as well. I'm just thinking about things in terms of rebuilds and whether insurance is available for rebuilds or not, whether QLDC in the immediate aftermath has got the capability or has thought about how to access the people to come in and look at houses and look at what's stable and what's not, obviously thinking of an earthquake. So I just wonder, I mean, this was just sort of ring fencing the community and looking at, how prepared are we? But I guess in some respects, we're only as prepared as the supporting agencies, and whether there's a piece to do around looking at how prepared is QLDC, how prepared is the ORC, what sort of capacity do we have in those critical service industries, building and so on, that we can access in those times of need. So just a query around that, and whether that's part of the bigger picture of work, or whether it's something that we could do separately to sort of sit alongside this.
I'm not sure, maybe Jean-Luc, if you want to tackle this, or if I don't know if Bill has anything else that he might want to add to that question.
Yeah, I can start, and if Bill you want to add to it, feel free. So, part of the adaptation strategy, we are looking at having action plans, and one area of work is around civil defense response. And that's looking to the different component of the civil defense, so ORC, QLDC sides. And yes, I don't know, Bill, if you have anything else to add.
I guess I'm asking because, being on the QLDC, I'm well aware of the zero figure beside our emergency response budget.
It's not quite that, Nikki. But
well, this was an answer to our financial officer saying that we do not have a sum set aside. So other than Bill's budget, when things turn to custard, there is not necessarily the funding sitting there, the capital available to rebuild parts of critical services and so on. So not that we're not doing anything, and I totally value what you're doing, Bill. Sorry, I'm just aware that this piece that we're doing around the wharves is great to hear about. And I'm just thinking about the bigger picture. Have the agencies run through a scenario across all the departments? So not yours, Bill, but planning and building and so on, to understand how to mobilize quickly, because the longer things take, the more uncertainty there is, the more chance there is that the community will move on and fall apart. If we know that the agencies are ready and the response is efficient and we can see things happening, we're more likely to retain our community. Does that make sense? And so I just would like to see some sort of piece where the agencies reflect on their own ability to cope with different scenarios and how that impacts our community resilience.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to respond, Nikki. Really good question, really big question as well. And look, I did spend, as I said, Tuesday morning revisiting particularly the AF8 scenario in a multi-agency setting with the Defence Force, with representatives from NEMA, the AF8 program, as well as Emergency Management Otago. Look, I'm hesitant to be able to answer this question, but there is a significant body of work happening at a national, regional and local level. In the next couple of weeks, there's going to be quite significant scenarios based around AF8 planning. It is one of those CAT plans that we talk about at a national level, as well as the Hikaringi subduction zone and the volcanic plateau, 3 big scenarios that could impact the nation. There's significant national, regional and local level planning underway, but will we ever be prepared? Well, if we've got another 47 years to prepare for it, we might be, but yeah, it's always I guess an ongoing challenge as we start to wrap our head around the extent of what the scenario looks like. So there's quite a bit of detail that we can share around all of the sector groups and all of the work activity that's happening. It's a bit too much to unpack in this setting, but what I can give some assurances around is that we are looking at a localized AF8 plan that starts to really get into the detail around how we'd coordinate a response, and importantly, how we would pre-prepare for the scenario and also consider the recovery implications as well. So that's starting to pull together intelligence from all the different sectors, from the community level, looking at health, looking at all of the different kind of areas that would be disrupted. And it certainly does look at areas like Glenorchy, Kingston, Makarora and other areas, and understanding how they'll need to operate under, when there are these severe outages. So through all this work, there is, some light at the end of a very long tunnel that, we're better prepared now, I believe, than we ever have in terms of starting to connect the dots. But it is a big challenge. I won't, so perhaps, we can talk a little bit more in detail about that in terms of how we start to kind of share all of that work program. As I said, there is some significant activities coming up, and which we'll be able to kind of, I think, start to share and give some better insights to everything that's happening in that space.
Yeah, look, that was a good answer, Bill. I think
that's the best I can do, Nikki.
It was great, and the sharing of that work program so we all understand what's going on and upcoming would be amazing. The only other thing I wanted to say was just around those visitor numbers, because I looked in the appendices and the visitor numbers are using quite low visitor numbers. From what QRDC's data, they're really tiny. It's got like 300 or something on a peak day. And I don't know if that's what was considered through the bulk of the report, but it just seemed low. So just wanted to emphasize that piece around visitor numbers. I mean, I think when we had the floods in the 90s, 94, John? Or 92, the numbers were thousands, right, that were up here for a day at the Glenorchy races. So just don't underestimate the scale of that potential problem and how many people we may need to get out of here fast. Thanks.
Thanks, Nikki. Did anyone else from OSC want to add anything to that question? Or Anne, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add also that we're looking at, we do realise that people have a lot of questions around, what things might look like after an event, a significant event, and that piece around, what recovery might need to look like, what decisions might need to be made, that would be it. There's certain components of that are well established through the Building Act, and certain components of it that we've seen examples elsewhere in New Zealand where you would have more of a one-off process. And so we want to provide some information based, also some examples of things that have occurred in other places and what decisions have need to be made to support recovery under those circumstances. So that is a component that we are thinking about in developing the strategy. So we can shine as much light as we can on that based on current knowledge. So that's probably all I really want to say there.
Oh, thank you, Anne. Oh, Nikki. Yep. Oh, you.
In the absence of other hands up, the other thing was just around the the insurability of properties going forward and the impact of this process on that. And I don't know whether, I don't know enough about how the insurance industry works, but there are people concerned about, obviously, the impact of this whole process before anything even happens, on their ability to get by and their existing resilience, just on a day-to-day basis. So I just wanted to flag that up and just see if anybody had any thoughts, if we are talking to the insurance agencies, are they making contact with the ORC? Is that something that people are taking into account? Because it's, we're looking at people's future resilience and concerned about that, but actually we're living in the here and now, and we need to be really, cognizant of how this impacts on people right now.
Jean-Luc or Anne, would you like to respond to that question? It's a tough one. It's a big question. Sorry. Yeah.
But it's on everybody's minds, and so I thought,
absolutely.
Better ask it.
Yeah.
Just to understand what's going on in the background, if anything.
Yeah, so no, we haven't been contacted by insurance companies specifically around Glenorchy. So the information we have is, we put that on the ORC Natural Hazard database, so it's accessible, but we didn't have any direct contact from an insurance company about the information.
And in terms of monitoring what's going on in the industry generally, do you have any concerns? Do you have any insights that might help the community, or not at this point?
Generally speaking, the insurance sector is welcoming more work around adaptation and clarification from central government on roles and responsibilities. You probably heard I think it was last week, the Parliament decided for inquiry around natural hazard adaptation. And that's about really making sure, clarifying who does what, how adaptation is going to be funded, and insurance, I think, is going to be a big part of that discussion. So I think from a national central government level, that will help those questions around insurance and how as a country we're going to pay for adaptation.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, if anything comes by, I mean, I'll keep my eye out, but it would be great to feed some of the relevant stuff back to the community, maybe, if that's possible. Like I said, I'll keep my eye out as well. Thanks, Jean-Luc.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nikki. And that's something that, we can definitely consider moving forward as well, about communicating what we know about that back to the community too. I'll go to John Glover again.
Yeah, thanks. Last one for me. And just to answer the insurance question, it'll get more expensive and then it'll get free because we won't have any. That's my cynic's view. But Jean-Luc, thanks. Actually, you've maybe answered my question. I was going to ask about the inquiry into the National Hazards Adaptation, just try and find out where that was at, because they were looking to, I think they're having whether it was a select committee inquiry or whatever, and they were asking for submissions and things. Where is that at? And do you think it's going to progress with the current government, or is it one of these things that will just be on hold?
So the inquiry, I think that one inquiry was launched last year, and that was put on hold. But last week, I think the Minister for Climate Change has announced a new inquiry from the Finance and something committee, select committee. And the time frame for that, I think they need to check, but I think the inquiry is until September this year, with aiming having a recommendation and potential consequence for legislation in 2025. So the current government is reaffirming the need to do more work around adaptation, clarification about roles and responsibilities, and how we're going to fund adaptation in New Zealand. So yeah, it's the new inquiry will take into account the submission that have been made at the previous one with the previous government. And that's great to see like continuity in focus on adaptation and climate change, regardless of the political parties. I think that's a great achievement that has been done in the previous government, having that multiple parties agreeing on the fact that climate change and adaptation work need to progress regardless of change of government.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. If we don't have any more questions, I think I'll just ask one final question before closing things up. So this is probably for my colleagues at ORC, but just a final question about, obviously we're doing a lot of, and Jean-Luc, you spoke a little bit about this at the beginning, but we're doing a lot of work at the head of the lake, and there are lots of other studies going on and progressing at the moment as well. We have the Glenorchy and Kinloch risk assessment and the feasibility study in nature-based solutions, feasibility study occurring as well. So how does this piece fit in with all the other work that's going on, and how will it be used to inform adaptation in the future?
And you would like to answer that one?
Can do, yes. So, in terms of the adaptation strategy, the first draft of the adaptation strategy, which we're working towards this year, this is one of the key documents that contributes to that. And it was, obviously requested by the community as well. And it brings together all this great information that was well known in the community, and obviously we'd had community engagement conversations about a lot of these things, but we hadn't had a place where we'd drawn it all together and made it available to decision makers who will then be able to use it in their decision making process. So we want, it provides a weight, to the social and economic aspects, as well as the risk assessment will give us, the requested a way of comparing the risk quantitatively at Head of Lake area or Glenorchy area compared to other parts of New Zealand, and the engineering feasibility and nature-based solutions is having that look at what sort of engineering solutions might be feasible, how much might they cost. And so that those pieces will come together with all the foundational work we've done, and that provides a really great basis for decision makers to take forward. And then obviously at future times, if a decision is made to head towards other options, there's the also business cases that councils put forward are around additional levels of investment. And so that would be another opportunity for additional economic information, for example, to feed into the process. But where we're at in terms of delivering the strategy, this is one of those key documents on the table.
Got it. Thank you very much. So just share my screen. So just to finish the evening, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending this evening and skipping the quiz. If you've skipped the quiz this evening, to come along, and thank you also to Joe and Jerry for their time to share the findings. We really appreciate everyone's kind of support and feedback into this process, and specifically for this study as well. So thank you very much for that. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to email us at this email there, or if you'd like more information, you can check out our program webpage, and that's where the recording of this session will be uploaded tomorrow. And as Jean-Luc mentioned earlier, we have a number of other events and kind of milestones coming later in the year. So if you would like to be kept up to date on those, check out our program webpage or sign up to our newsletter for the latest updates. And the ORC YouTube page is just there as well, because you can watch our videos and any council meetings and things on there. So I will close this evening's sessions with a karakia. Kua mutu a mātou mahi, mo tēnei wā. Manaakitanga mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, aio ki te aorangi. Pō Marie, have a good evening everyone and see you next time. Thank you very much for coming.